Hello, thanks for coming out. As he mentioned, my name is Brent. I'm a web developer at Grand Valley. I work at the institutional marketing department there. So basically, everything that comes after gvsu.edu, we do. So the main website, custom CMS, and a lot of custom projects for different departments. And this is Harold. This is who we're here to talk about. Harold is what I personify as my grunt.js minion. So I'm going to show you guys how to set one up yourself. Basically, I think of it as a little guy who does all the stupid little tasks I have to do 100 times a day that I don't want to do anymore. So yeah, just out of curiosity, how many of you guys are like web developers as opposed to application developers? Okay. And how about Node.js? Is there like anyone that knows a ton of Node.js? No? Good. Okay. Grunt's written in Node.js. I don't know a lot of Node.js either. Every time I give this talk, I'm nervous there's going to be somebody who's like a Node.js guru and they're calling me out on something, but I think we're good. So what is grunt.js? Is everybody somewhat familiar with Node.js? So basically it's JavaScript that runs, for lack of a better term, on a server on your command line instead of in a website. So grunt.js is written in Node.js. It's basically a task automator. So it has a ton of different plugins, and you set it up and say, when this thing happens, I want you to do this or this or this. These things being kind of the plugins you can do. So I'm going to walk through a bunch of examples in web development because that's what I do, so that's what I use it for. But there are a ton of other uses. So we're going to be on the command line probably a fair amount today. But it's really not that scary. It's going to be okay. Especially I talk to web developers a lot. They're not so familiar with the command line. Maybe some of you guys who aren't doing so much web, it's not so different. But the stuff you have to use, even though it's all run from the command line, it's really basic stuff. If you can do any type of programming, you're going to be just fine. So with that, we're going to talk about installing grunt.js. So like I said, it runs on Node.js, so wherever you're going to be running Grunt, typically, if you do local development, it'll be on your laptop. You can install it on your server and run it there, but in most cases, you're going to have it on your computer. If you go to this link, nodejs.org/en/download, they have an installer. It's just click, 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 and it'll be installed. So being a Node program, Grunt gets installed, and all the packages for Grunt get installed using the Node way of installing things, which is npm. If you're familiar with Linux from way back before it was super pretty, they had apt-get. And basically, you just type it in and you'd say, hey, I want this package, and it'd go out and it'd find it and it'd download it for you. That's kind of the basis for npm and Node. It's the same concept. npm stands for Node Package Manager. So you're basically going to say npm install, and then whatever you want to install, and it'll go out and find where the package is and download it and install it locally for you so you can use it. So before you can do anything with Grunt, the first thing you have to do is install the Grunt command line interface. So it's just one command, npm install -g, installs it globally so you won't have to do it over and over again. And then you're ready to set up a project. And a Grunt project is basically two files. It's going to be a package.json file, which is actually not Grunt specific. That's how Node handles dependencies. So basically it's going to be a file explaining what your project is and what it needs to run. We'll go through this in more detail. And then grunt file.js, which is what we'll talk about the most, is basically your configuration file. So it's also actually, it's just JavaScript, and it defines what tasks you want to run when. So package.json, like I mentioned, it's all about managing dependencies. And the nice thing about this is that npm actually has a tool that you can use to create it by default, so you don't have to manually type it out every time. So to set this up, it's basically just a couple steps. First thing, I guess I should preface, all of this is based on being in a local directory. So like if you're working, like on my web server, I have 200 different main domains off of gvsu.edu. For each project I want to have Grunt on, I'm going to be doing that locally. So the sample project I'm going to be talking about today is a website I made. It's called Economic Impact. So it's gvsu.edu/economic impact. So everything we're going to do, we're going to want to be in that folder first. That's where we're going to put the package.json and the grunt file.js. So first you're going to open up the command line and get to your folder. Next you're going to type this npm init command, and that basically just sets up that package.json for you. I don't know if you guys work with JSON a lot. If you've ever manually edited a lot, you always miss a comma or a quote or a double quote somewhere. So this kind of steps around that, at least at the beginning. And all it's going to do is it's going to go through here and ask you a bunch of questions. What's the name of the project, the version, a description, some keywords, and you can just keep pressing enter until it gets to author, and then type your name in and press enter, and it'll set it up. So, can you guys see that okay? I know sometimes text is a little different. So this is package JSON, basically right out of the box. So like I said, it's just a JSON object, properties about your project. Not a whole lot interesting here yet. Everybody with me so far? Cool? Okay. So now we need to install our local task plugins. So you remember I said it was a task kind of manager. So now we have to install the actual tasks that we want to play with. And I'll show you a little later on where you can find them. There's a ton of them and they're searchable. It's easy to find them. But when you want to install them, it's the same thing we did a second ago to install Grunt. But instead of doing it locally, we're going to do it just for our project. So the first thing we need to run Grunt is Grunt. So we're going to type npm install, and then the package name, and then that -- save dev. What that does is it automatically adds it to that package JSON file, so that again you don't have to go back in and manually edit JSON because it always goes wrong. This would be an example. After I've installed Grunt, you'll see this new section down here called dev dependencies. So package JSON is a node thing, not necessarily just a Grunt thing. And that -- save dev will add this here in a property called dev dependencies. And basically, that's just telling anyone that kind of understands Node or is working with your project for the first time, these are the things that you're going to need installed when you're working on this project. If it's something else, you can also just do -- save, and that will add a thing called dependencies, but that is saying this is what this project needs to run. And typically the things you're installing for Grunt, you just need for development, not necessarily for production. So that's why you do the save dev, like that. Cool, everyone with me so far? All right, so package.json set up, we're halfway there. Now we have to do the Grunt file. And this, if you've ever looked at one, like go online and just check out like a sample, they can be really intimidating. It's just a ton of JavaScript objects and it doesn't make a lot of sense at first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of show you an overview of it and then run through a couple plugins I use, and then we're actually going to just set one of these up with you. So I'll kind of speed over some of this. That's because I'm going to do a demo later that should cover most of it. So this is a Grunt file. Basically, you're going to define a JavaScript function called module.exports. That's what Grunt, the program, is expecting. It's the only parameter it knows how to process. You're going to set up your initial config like this, load in that package.json, and when you do that, it just gives this file the ability to see all the information we have stored in package.json. This is what I'm going to talk about in depth. This is where you set up all the tasks you want to run. So I have 4 tasks here, basically Sass, Uglify, JSON, and Watch. I'll go over that in more detail in a second. Down here, you're going to say, these are the additional node packages I need. So if you're setting this up, make sure these are installed because these are what I need. Typically, they're going to more or less be a one-to-one correlation to the tasks you're using, but they don't necessarily have to be. And then you're going to register a task. So by default, when you set up a task, you have these names up here. So I could, at this point, go to the command line and type grunt sass, and it would run this sass task up here. But it also gives you the ability to kind of chain tasks together. And one you have to have is default. So basically, from the command line in this project, you type grunt and nothing else. It's going to look for this default task and know what to do. And in this case, I told it to run, all 4 of these. So that's kind of a super basic overview. Is anyone totally lost yet? It's okay. Okay. So what can Grunt do? It can do a lot. I gave this talk a couple months ago, and there were 4,000 plugins. And I checked it yesterday before I came here, and there's 5,347. So it's a really large pool of things you can do with Grunt. This website here is where you can go search for them. It's pretty easy to just search. They've got them tagged and filtered and labeled. So we're going to talk about 5 of them that I use for web development. This one you'll probably use for just about anything, even not web development. Watch. So basically what it does is it watches a file for a change, and if a file's changed, it does something. You tell it that something to do. So if you guys are familiar with Sass at all, maybe, it has a similar command where you can tell it to like watch the Sass file, and if it changes, save a CSS file. Same thing except for any type of file, and you can do anything you want to it. My personal favorite use of grunt.js, and why I use it probably more than any other reason, is this watch command has it. They play it down. It's just an option. It's called live reload. And basically what that does is it has a Chrome extension that goes with it, and if you install that Chrome extension and say watch these files, live reload true, then anytime you save one of those files, it's going to refresh your browser for you. So if you're making changes to code a lot, or it comes in really useful if you're doing a lot of styling changes, you can say watch my CSS file, and every time I hit save, which if you program like me is about every 12 keystrokes because I've had files get deleted, so I save all the time. And then you can have your browser up in another monitor, and it'll automatically refresh as you're typing. So we'll talk about that in a second. JSHint is a JavaScript linter. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that term. It basically is a program that goes through your JavaScript and tries to catch common errors or bugs before it gets to the browser. So syntax errors, some logic errors. It has a ton of configurations. One I like to use a lot is you can set it to throw an error if you declare an unused variable. So a lot of times, especially if I'm doing something new in JavaScript, I'll be working on it, and I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm kind of playing around. I got all this stuff going on, and I get done, and I'm like, okay, cool. And I ship it to production, and then like a week later, I look at it, and I'm like, man, I have all this stuff from when I was just learning how to do it that I declared up at the top, and then I got rid of because I figured out a better way to do it. So that if you have that issue like I do, it's really useful. Uglify. Grunt is really great if you're trying to optimize your website. It does a lot of things that, for lack of a better term, as web developers we get kind of lazy about, like minification. So Uglify is a minification and obfuscation library, and you can also combine a lot of files together into one. So it's nice if you want to logically separate your JavaScript files, have them all indented and commented and pretty, and then it will automatically smush them all together into one really long line of JavaScript. We'll talk about CSS min, which is basically the same thing as Uglify does for JavaScript. This does for CSS. It minifies it, and you can use it to combine multiple files. I mentioned Sass earlier. Grunt also integrates with Sass and Less and Stylus and most of the other preprocessors, which is really nice when I found that out, because before I was using Sass, so I had Sass watching Sass files and saving CSS, and then I had Grunt, and I had all these things going, and this kind of lets you package them all together. So, excuse me. Those are kind of the 5 packages. So we're going to go into the command line real quick. So does anybody have any questions at this point? I know I kind of zipped through everything, so you probably do. But if you have any you want to ask, go for it. Minification. Yep. So basically, it is a process of taking a file and making it as small as possible. So I'll show you samples when we get into it. But basically, if you have a JavaScript file, right, and you want it to be readable and usable for other developers that might work with it, you'd have like a for loop, and then you'd indent it. And you'd have really long variable name, not really long, but descriptive variable names. And there's different levels of minification, but the basic idea is to make it as small as possible. So it's going to take all those line returns and get rid of them, right? Because JavaScript doesn't care about that. It can process it, and then it'll go through and rename variables to like A. So like if you ever looked at like the source code of Gmail, maybe I'm the only one that does that, there will be like single letter variables all over the place, and you'll look at it and you'll be like, how can anyone possibly write this? It's garbage. It's because they have their kind of source code, and then they run it through a minification process that outputs that. So does that help? Okay.
Same concept for the object one.
The
It had minification.
Okay, yes, I'm not going to say that word again because I have a really hard time pronouncing it, and I said it once right, and I'm going to call it a night. So that is similar to like renaming the variables to letters. It's basically just a process of making your code hard to read. So whether there's any value to that, people do it for security, but it's not really that secure. But it's a process of making your code harder to read, basically. Yeah.
And so you're not developing in Node.js, you're just using
Correct. The only Node.js that exists is basically use the package manager to install Grunt, and Grunt itself runs in Node, but you're never, it's a black box. Yeah. Obviously, because Grunt is a Node tool, it has a lot of plugins to work with Node. And kind of the philosophy behind it goes with Node. So if you are programming in Node, I'm sure I just started learning Node, and it's kind of like making sense why Grunt does some of the things the way it does. But yeah, you can use it in any language. At Grand Valley, we program in Cold Fusion, and I can use it with that. So I'm sure PHP or any of those, you'd be able to use it pretty easily. Yeah?
All right, so I'm using .NET Visual Studio. So is there any, you know how they have it with all those packages, you just pull in a little thing here for SAS, another one for less.
Right.
From NuGet. Do you have an opinion if that's, you know, after you've used both ways? You have
I have not programmed in .NET for 6 years. So it's been a little while. I probably wouldn't be able to comment on its current. I like what this does now better than what it did then, but I'm sure .NET has moved on since then. Okay, cool. All right, we'll start the demo. And I tried to make this so you guys could see it. I gotta find my mouse here. Okay. So this is the command line, obviously, and I just moved into my project, Economic Impact. And over here, I can't make this bigger, so I apologize. But there's nothing installed yet, right? There's no anything. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to say npm init. And this is that thing I was telling you about. So it's going to default the name to Economic Impact, the version to 1. We'll add a description. One time. And it asks some questions that are more node specific. You can just skip them. They don't really matter. It's nice it integrates with Git. If you're using it, it sees what your repo is and stores that. Keywords, author, license. And then it's going to say, hey, this is the package.json file I have based on what you told me. So I'm going to write that out. You say yes. And if we look here, now there's a package.json file. So I wasn't lying when I said it was really easy and not that scary, even though it's Node, which can be scary. So if we come over here, look at this package.json, right? It's basically just like my demo. We've got this dev dependencies up here, and it's empty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say install grunt save dev.
So at this point, you've already installed Grunt globally.
Correct. Yep, so that first slide I showed you, you have to do one time. So you install Node.
Here's making it project specific.
Yes, exactly. See if I can type my password and if the Wi-Fi works. Looks like it does. So if I come over here now, I've got Grunt as a dev dependency. And sorry, one second. Got a little cheat sheet, so I do it in the right order. Cool. So now Grunt's installed, but there's no grunt file.js, right? So I don't know what I'm doing. So if I come here and say grunt, it's going to try and run, but it's going to say, hey, I can't find the grunt file. So at this point, we need to set up our grunt file. To save you guys some time, I am going to use the magic of Git to grab this grunt file. The reason I'm going to do that is because that's probably what you're going to do when you set it up, right? You're going to go to grunt.js, find their demo, copy it, and you'll have this. So modules.export is what we're going to pass to grunt. We're going to set up the init config. We'll pass it this package. The first task we're going to set up is watch. We're going to say live reload equals true. And then down here, we're going to pass the files that we want it to watch, right? So this will be different based on the language you're writing in the project itself. But this is probably something similar to what I would do. Like I said, Grand Valley writes in Cold Fusion, so those are .cfm and .cfc files. It'd be .php or .py or whatever language you're writing in. How many people are familiar with Git? Okay, good. So it uses basically the same syntax as the git ignore file for how to add and remove files. So basically, ** is anything followed by a file name .cfm or .cfc or .css. This one here is good to note. So _post is at Grand Valley kind of how we handle our controller files. It is usually helpful to turn that off on your controller files. That way if you're working on it, every time you save it, it's not resubmitting a post request. I had that happen and I didn't realize it for a while, and I submitted like 300 requests into a form. So then down here, we're just going to say the default grunt task is watched, right? So if I come over here now and I type grunt, it's going to say it's running the watch task. I'm just waiting, and then nothing exciting is going to happen. But if I come over here, this is the project I'm working in. Like I said, there's a live reload plugin you can install from the Chrome extension store. And if I turn that on and then come over here and say change the title to test, then when I come back here, it's already updated. And it seems like a really little thing, and when I was first learning Grunt, someone told me about that, and I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then I started using it, and now I get incredibly irritated if I have to work on a project that doesn't have it. It's crazy how much saving that 4 seconds of save, go to my browser, Command R, how many times you do that in a given day. Like I didn't even realize how often I was doing it until I didn't have to do it, and then I had to start doing it again. So if you get nothing else out of this talk, just try the live reload. It's not that hard. You could do it, and you will never program the same again. So that is kind of the basics of how to set up a task. I'm going to talk about the JavaScript one next, unless anyone has any questions.
So when you did the git checkout, you skipped the part of installing plugins?
Yes. Yep.
And are those just normal installers, or do you install those with NPM?
You install those with NPM, yeah. So if I wanted to install that watch command, it would be that.
Okay, so that alters your package.json.
It
doesn't update your grunt.
Correct. Yep. The grunt file is basically your config file. The package.json is like the node framework that Grunt is running on.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Anybody else? No? Okay, so now we're going to take a look at JS hint, which is, I tried to do these in the order of if you're just going to try it, start with these things. So JS hint, so I just would have installed JS hint from the command line, so npm install grunt contrib JS hint. And then I came in here and I say, okay, I want to create a new task called JS hint. The files I want this task to run on is this array. So grunt file.js, so I want it to check my grunt file to make sure it's valid JavaScript. And then for this project, I have a main.js. Another typical way to do it would be something like this, where you say anything in my files JS folder except for like library files, like Bootstrap, that kind of stuff. They have a tendency to not have super strict JavaScript, so it'll throw a bunch of errors and make your grunt file very unhappy. But for this one, we're just going to look at main.js. In JS hint, and then we would set options here, right? In a typical grunt project, we'd say, like live reload true. So JS hint, if you go there, they have a ton of configuration options. They have so many configuration options that they like to put them in their own file called JS hint RC. Basically, they provide this for you, so it's defaulted, and they kind of have descriptions of what they are. So a lot of this is personal preference, and kind of probably the code guide your company has, like what kind of JavaScript you're going to write. If you're just doing it for yourself, you can set these to whatever you want. But things like requiring brackets, requiring triple equals instead of double equals, capitalization for all constructors. And this is just the options I use. They have a ton more on their website. So this is basically setting up your configuration. And then down here, I'll mention this real quick. It will throw errors if you try and reference global variables that aren't in your file, because it says, hey, this variable was never defined. It doesn't know that, in my case, I'm using a web browser to run this. So document is always going to be defined, or window is always going to be defined. So you just set up your globals down here. Okay, so.
Do those globals come default, some globals, or no?
Nope, no. Yeah, but typically, the nice thing about this is once you get it set up once, I'll talk about it later, you basically just copy it over and change it. So like I always have window and document and $ and jQuery, yeah, because there are very few projects I work on that don't have that. So now if I come over here and type grunt.js hint, I'm just going to reference these directly so we don't see the output from all the other commands. But if you see down here, I also added JS hint to the default option. So if I just type grunt, it would run that and the watch command. So come over here. And I would like to tell you that this was not actual code that I used that looked like this the runtime when I ran this for the demo, but it was. So if you look here, there's a lot of stuff, and it's really hard to read. And I'm sure someone likes this output, but I don't. So there is a plugin called JS Hint Stylish, and if you install that, sorry about that. It gives you a much prettier output, and it gives you a lot of configuration options. So this is how I like to see it: line, column, and what the actual error is, right?
So what did you change there? You did another checkout. So.
Yep. So I added this option right here. So I went to the grunt.js and I was like, there's got to be a way to make this prettier. So I looked for JS hint better output and found this JS hint dash stylish. So I installed that with npm install and then just came in here and told the reporter to require this stylish plugin. And then it reformatted the output. So that's kind of the nice thing about grunt is that, like I said, it's all little pieces that you can kind of stick together to use however you want to use them. This is some of the things JS hint. I was missing a semicolon. Some things I would have never thought of. Like I'm doing a lot of math in this site. It's a parallax site, so I have to keep track of how fast things are moving. And I would type a decimal like 0.5, and I wouldn't put a 0 in front of it. And to me, I'm like, well, whatever. But it brings out a good point that if you're writing in something that could possibly be an object, then you should put a 0 in front of it, right? So stuff like that. And then it'll yell at you if you have used a variable without defining it, which is really nice for catching like leaky variable scope. So like $window, I didn't want that to be a global scope, but I forgot to type var in front of it. So it catches that. How are we doing? Is that making sense? Cool, okay. I am just going to, again, magically fix all those errors. So if I do this, it's going to find one more error, and that's that a function I had created, slow scroll, was defined but never used. It's because in this project that's used in a different JavaScript file. I could have defined it as a global, but I just didn't mind having that error there. So at this point, you might have noticed when I run grunt, or here. So typically, if I'm running grunt, I want that watch command to be running, right? Because I'm programming, so I want it to be library loading. What happens is it runs this JS hint, and it sees there's an error, and it says, hey, this is broken, and it aborts grunt. So that's less than ideal if what I'm using grunt for is to run all the time to watch my files. So there is 2 ways to do this. There's -- force, and basically that's going to let it error and then continue on to the next task, which for most cases is fine. The only downside about that is that this is going to force all the tasks to continue. So say I had 12 tasks running this, one of them being like JavaScript unit tests. If those fail, I want it to yell at me and tell me something's wrong because I did something wrong, I need to fix it. So there is a way to add the force option just to an individual task. You just have to set that up in the grunt file. So here for my JS hint task, I have set force equal to true in the options for JS hint. So now JS hint is going to run like I typed -- force, but all the other tasks we're about to set up, which if they fail means something is really wrong, not just something's undefined, that's going to abort grunt. Cool? Okay. So next, we will talk about the minification. So if I come over here, I'm going to define a new task called uglify. I'm going to install the plugin, which is grunt contrib uglify. And I didn't mention, but I'm going to add that down here where I'm telling this grunt file what packages they use. And then it's going to be pretty similar, right? I'm going to have to tell it what files I want to watch. This is just the name. You can name it whatever you want. In this case, I used it dist. That's kind of a default for uglify. That's my distribution. That's like the end code I want. And at the end, I'm going to want this files.js main.min.js, and I want to create that from my main.js. So if I come over here, I've got this main.js, right? And it's fairly good looking JavaScript, line breaks and indents and everything. And if I run this, I'm going to set mangle to false. That's basically the option to obfuscate the code, which typically I don't feel the need to do because it's not a security issue. So now it's just going to minimize it. And you can also add this banner, which is basically going to put a line up at the top. I like to put the timestamp that the code was minified. I found that really helpful in troubleshooting. That way, if you're talking to someone and they're like, I don't understand, this isn't working, you can take a look at that and see if they have a cached version of it or what's going on. And this is basically just going to put this string here up at the top of the file. So now if I come over here, type grunt uglify, it's going to run. It's going to say one file was created, ran without errors. If I come back here and look at main.min.js, this is what a minified file would look like. So it took this and stripped out all the comments and all the white space, and now there's this. And I think it probably cut the size not quite in half. It kind of varies by project, but especially if you start developing for mobile, I would really look into performance optimization. There's a lot of things like this you can do that aren't that hard for you to do that probably won't make a difference for you when you're sitting at your office with gigabit internet, but that person on their phone who can't get your website to load, the JavaScript file being 2/3 the size of what it is when you develop is pretty nice for them. So there are a couple options here. So like I said, you can have mangle, which basically, if we set that to true and run it again and take a look at it, you'll see stuff like this. So it's replaced all my variable names that it knew it could replace with single characters. So that would be sort of obfuscation. Some other options it has, you can also use it the other way. So if you set beautify to true, it'll actually take your JavaScript and intelligently indent it. So that's nice if you work with someone who's maybe not super OCD about keeping their JavaScript files clean. You can run it through this and it'll clean it all up for you. You can set it to preserve the comments if you want to leave your comments in for whatever reason. There's an option called screw IE8. I actually have no idea what that does, but I like to mention it because it says screw IE8 and it's kind of fun. And it also can generate source maps. If you're familiar with what a source map is, so you've got this minified file, you send it out to production, and then someone says, hey, I have a bug. And you're like, okay. And you go and you check it out and you inspect it in Chrome like you normally would, and then you look at it and you're like, well, it's on line 1 because everything is on line 1. There's actually a thing called a source map. So it creates a separate file that you can serve up alongside your minified JavaScript, and basically it won't be rendered to the client, but if you open up developer tools, it's basically a map from the minified file to the regular file. So you can look at your minified file in Chrome Developer Tools and it'll say there's an error on line 208, so it helps to be debug. So that's really super handy if you're using minification. Yeah, any questions about that one?
Can we combine multiple JavaScript files into one?
Yep, so right here where you're passing in the files, it's as simple as just passing in another one right here. And it'll do this in order. So if you have things that are dependent on other functions being declared, if you just put the dependent ones first, it'll load it on top of each other. There's also other plugins that do specifically that. There's a concat plugin for Grunt that if you don't need to minify or whatever, it basically just says take these files and make them into this file. Anybody else?
How easy is it to browse those 5,348 helpers out there?
It's pretty easy. I don't have the URL. They've got a really nice search. So their search, there's a decent sized community, so there's a lot of blog posts if you are looking for, like one of the things we focused on recently at Grand Valley was performance optimization. So if you just look, there'll be here are 5 Grunt plugins to look at if you're trying to optimize performance. So I have found it pretty easy. It hasn't been too bad.
And I mean, you said the way you typed in JS hin output, better JS hin output.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I guess I don't know what I haven't found, but I've never not been able to find something that worked for me in a couple of Google searches. Yeah, anybody else? We'll talk about CSS real quick. This one is pretty easy. It's basically the same thing. As Uglify, CSS min. Same thing, I want to add a banner. You can set the compatibility mode. So sadly, for this project, I had to support IE7, so I put IE7, but you can do up. And basically what that does is if you don't have that, then it's going to probably mess up your browser hacks. If you guys are familiar with any of those, like if you put a asterisk / after some of them, it works in IE8, but not IE7. That'll get stripped out. I found out the hard way when you minify the CSS if you don't specify a compatibility level. Other than that, it's basically the same thing. Unfortunately, one of the sometimes challenges of working with Grunt is that each of the plugins, they kind of have free reign over how they set up their things. So like you'll see this one has a source variable and a destination variable as opposed to before it was just one line with an input and output and an array of inputs. But they are documented pretty well. So this is going to do the same thing as my JavaScript did. So if I look at styles.css, I've got a lot of CSS here. I come over here. File created, as you can see, it took it from 15K down to 10K, so about 2/3 the size again. And then if I come over here, it's the same thing. So this would be an example of a minified CSS. Any questions about that one? That one's pretty easy. The last thing I will talk about is Sass. So how many of you guys are familiar with Sass or CSS preprocessors? Okay, so basically what Sass does is it takes CSS and tries to make it more of a programming language. So you can set variables, you can declare functions, they don't call them functions, but that's what they are. And then you compile that into CSS. Since it looks like there's not a ton. So this would be a Sass file, right? And in CSS, this would not work, right? I couldn't define light blue to be this. And I can also import other files. And then when I run Sass compile, it's going to take this and convert it into CSS that any browser can understand. So those are really handy. That's probably a whole nother talk. But it is nice that Grunt integrates with it because you can set it up to watch your Sass file and then create a minified, because Sass supports minification as well, CSS file. And then you don't have to worry about running Sass in one window and Grunt in another window and programming in another window, and then you got stuff all over the place. It also supports less and stylus. I actually went to a talk of the guy who wrote Grunt, and he likes to use stylus because it's written in Node as well, so it and Grunt play really well together, as opposed to Sass is written in Ruby. So Grunt has to basically fire up an instance of Ruby to run Sass, and then it has to report back to Grunt. It works fine. It's what we use at Grand Valley. But if you're just picking one and you want to go the Grunt way, you might want to look at stylus just because they play really well together.
So stylus is
Just another preprocessor, yeah. Sass is definitely part of the reason we use Sass instead of that is because Sass outside of Grunt seems to have a bit more support, a little bit bigger community behind it, but yeah. But they all have plugins that work with Grunt.
So when you're using watch and you're making edits to your Sass file, does it recompile that to?
It does. So if I come over here and type grunt, it's going to do a lot of things, right? Because now I got a lot of things going on. So it's going to check my JavaScript. It's going to remind me that this slow scroll function is not defined. It's going to minify my JavaScript. I got rid of the CSS min task because Sass is going to do the same thing. But it's going to run the Sass distribution, which is going to take my Sass file and turn it into style.min.css. So if I look back over here, this is how Sass would minify it. So you see the banner is gone or whatever. Is that okay? So that is kind of 5 of the more useful ones. A couple other things to talk about here. Down here I mentioned you can define tasks, right? And you have to define a default task. So that's what runs whenever you type grunt, is it runs the default task, it runs JS hint, Uglyfly, Sass, and watch. You can also reference each of them individually, which is what I was doing for most of the demo. The nice thing is you can define as many of these as you want. So if we want to set up a minify task and tell it to just run Uglyfly and Sass, then if at any point we need to minify our code, all we have to do is type grunt minify and it's going to create all those minified files for us. Cool. Any questions about that? No? Cool. All right, I got a couple more slides here and then we can get on our way. So now we went through all that trouble. We've got this super at once confusing grunt file that we kind of understand now. We're using it in our economic impact site, and then that goes to the client, and then we start a new project the next day, right? So how do we get where we were on that project in the new project? So that is actually where the fact that grunt runs on Node comes in really handy. Because all you really need to do is copy those 2 files over and run npm install. And you know how I was saying we do that -- save dev? And it's adding that dev dependencies. So now at any point, anyone who has Node installs and has that package.json can just type npm install, and it's going to go out and it's going to install grunt and all of the grunt contrib, watch, grunt contrib, JS hint. So moving from project to project, you really just have to copy package.json and probably copy your grunt file over because that's pretty generic, so you can start with that and modify it. Run npm install. If your project structure has changed, so your JavaScript is somewhere else, you'd update that, and then you're done and you can have grunt ready to go. One quick note, again, that I found the hard way. So when you run npm install, you'll see this folder show up called node modules, and that is where Node stores all of its dependency files. You're going to want to exclude that from your version controller Git. Because you have npm, you can install that on any computer that has Node. You don't need to keep track of that and keep track of the changes. And if you do, there's typically hundreds-ish of individual files in there. And then at that point, you start tracking that in Git. And if new versions come out, it gets updated, and it can really mess up your Git repository.
You said it integrates with Git, so what's the advantage that we would have? What's the useful collaboration between Git and
Grunt? I guess I maybe misspoke a little bit in that it integrates with it. It's aware of it. So the Node part of it is aware that it has that repository. So it stores in that package JSON. And I think there may be other things Node can do with that, but
not Grunt being Node.
Yeah, it's just Node being aware of it. Basically, I just put that out there because when you start a new project, it figures out where your Git repo is and slaps it in there. So if you aren't expecting that, you're like, what did this do? There are quite possibly Grunt plugins that integrate with Git so that things get committed when you do certain things, but I have not played with those at all, or even know for sure they exist, but I would guess they do. So here's some resources. These 2 tutorials are super useful. I'll put this is up online somewhere. I'll tweet out the link later if you want to check it out. Grunt is not weird and hard is really good. It's more or less what I just went over, but in a little bit more detail. If you really like it or you want to get more in depth, that supercharging your grunt file talks about a lot of kind of advanced features. You can do things like run tasks concurrently. You can set it up to automatically load. You know how we had to load those npm tasks at the bottom of each? You can set it up to automatically figure out what those are and load them for you. And you can also, if you have a really big project, the grunt file can start to get into the 100 of lines, and it can get hard to maintain. There's a way so you can kind of split out each task into its own stub file and then load those into the grunt file when they load. That second link will go over all of those. So if you start getting into it, that's a good advanced tutorial. And that is about my talk. So if you have any other questions, feel free. Yeah.